An African father loses his 12-year-old son under mysterious circumstances. Not trusting the official version of what he was told, he takes desperate steps of installing a hidden camera in his coffin. But what he sees on the tape will dismay him to the core and change his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. In the early morning, as the sun was just beginning to clear the horizon and paint the sky with strokes of gold, Mr. Peter was already in his kitchen, brewing tea the way he always did, with a pinch of ginger for warmth. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that speaks volumes of the love and life that filled it every day. Today was no different, or so he thought, as he heard the familiar footsteps of his son Paul padding down the stairs. The kitchen was the heart of their home, where the walls had absorbed laughter, tears, and the sweet scent of his mother's jollof rice, which Paul loved so much. Paul, with his cheeky grin and eyes that sparkled like the morning dew, sauntered in, still in his pajamas, his hair a mess but his spirit bright. "Morning, Daddy," he greeted, his voice carrying the joy of youth. Mr. Peter looked up from stirring the tea, his heart swelling with pride and love. "Morning, my boy," he replied, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the rising sun. Breakfast was their ritual, a sacred time where the world outside didn't matter. Today they had bread and a kara with a side of fresh pack. Paul sat down, his school bag already packed, but in his hand was his sketchbook. He loved to draw, and his art was as much a part of their mornings as the food they ate. As they ate, Paul flipped open his sketchbook, revealing a new drawing. This one of them both riding a mythical creature, a dragon, across an imaginary Lagos skyline. "Look, Daddy, we're flying over the third mainland bridge," he said, giggling at the absurdity yet the joy of the image. Mr. Peter chuckled, his heart full. "We'd make quite the sight, wouldn't we, Paul? Flying over all the wahala of Lagos traffic." They laughed together, the sound echoing in the room, a melody of happiness that would soon become a memory Mr. Peter would cling to like a lifeline. The drawing was not just art, it was a snapshot of their bond, an immortalization of a moment that would be the last of its kind. But as they shared this laughter, neither knew the cruel twist fate was about to deal. Paul, in his innocence, talked about his plans for the day. A school project on Nigerian heroes, a football match after school, and perhaps some time at the local park where he'd teach his friend some new tricks on his bicycle. Mr. Peter listened, his mind already at work, planning how to surprise Paul with a new set of drawing pencils, knowing how much his son loved to create. As they finished their meal, Paul grabbed his bag, eager to start his day. "Don't forget your helmet, oh," Mr. Peter reminded, his voice laced with the concern only a father can have. Paul nodded. "I won't, Daddy. I'll be safe." With that, he dashed out, his laughter trailing behind like a promise of return. But promises, like life, can be fragile. Mr. Peter watched from the doorway as Paul mounted his bicycle, his small figure growing smaller by the second as he pedaled away. He felt a pang of something, perhaps a premonition or just the usual worry of a parent, but he shook it off, returning to the kitchen to clean up, unaware that the laughter of that morning would be the last he'd hear from his son. The day moved on, the sun climbed higher, but the shadow of what was to come was already lengthening over their lives. The morning had passed with the usual hum of daily life for Mr. Peter. He had left for his office, his mind still lingering on the joy of breakfast with Paul, the drawing of them flying over Lagos now on his desk, a silent guardian of their shared moments. The office was just another day of meetings, emails, and the occasional glance out the window, hoping to see the sun as bright as Paul's smile. But the day's peace was about to be shattered by a call that would echo in his ears for the rest of his life. It was around midday when his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize but answered out of habit. Mr. Peter? The voice was urgent, strained with the weight of bad news. There's been an accident. Your son, Paul, you need to come quick. The words hit him like a physical blow, his heart racing as he tried to process them. Where's my son? He demanded, his voice a mix of fear and authority. The caller gave him the location, near their home, just by the park where Paul loved to ride. Mr. Peter drove like a man possessed, his mind creating scenarios, each worse than the last. He arrived to see a small crowd gathered, police cars with their lights flashing, creating a kaleidoscope of blue and red against the day's brightness. His eyes scanned the scene, landing on the crumpled form of Paul's bicycle, now a mangled mess of metal and rubber. His heart stopped for a moment, then pounded furiously as he moved closer, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. There on the grass by the roadside lay Paul, surrounded by paramedics and officers. Mr. Peter's knees gave out and he stumbled forward, his vision blurring with tears. "Paul!" he cried out, his voice breaking as he reached his son. Paul's eyes were closed, his face peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos around him. The paramedics were somber, one shaking his head slightly at Mr. Peter's desperate gaze. "I'm sorry, sir. He didn't make it." The world seemed to tilt, the sounds around him turning into white noise. He heard snippets of conversations: bicycle accident, fell off, head injury. But something didn't sit right. Paul was careful, always wore his helmet. How could this have happened? As the reality set in, Mr. Peter noticed details that felt off. There was no blood where one would expect from a head injury. The bruises on Paul's arms and legs were inconsistent with a simple fall, and there, under Paul's nails, was dirt, as if he had fought or struggled. He questioned the officers, his voice a mix of anger and grief. How did this happen? He was just a boy on a bicycle. The police were sympathetic but firm. It was an accident, they said. But Mr. Peter couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The way they moved the body, the quickness to wrap things up, it all felt rehearsed, like they were eager to put this behind them. As the coroner's van took Paul away, Mr. Peter stood there, his life feeling like it had been uprooted. He watched, his mind racing with questions. Why was there dirt under Paul's nails if he just fell? Why the bruises not matching the narrative? His heart was torn between mourning and a burgeoning suspicion. He needed answers, not just for closure, but for justice. If Paul's death was more than an accident, he would find out, even if it meant confronting the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful community. That night, alone in his now too quiet home, Mr. Peter sat with Paul's drawing, the one from that very morning, now a bitter reminder of what was lost. He knew he couldn't let this go. The official story was too neat, too quick. Paul deserved more than that. With resolve hardening in his heart, Mr. Peter decided he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The journey he was about to embark on would be one of pain, discovery, and perhaps a fight for justice in a world that seemed all too willing to forget. The days following Paul's death were a blur of funerals, condolences, and a grief so heavy it seemed to seep into the very walls of Mr. Peter's home. Friends, neighbours, and even strangers came to pay their respects, their faces a gallery of sympathy and shared sorrow. But to Mr. Peter, their words felt distant, like echoes from another world. He moved through these days in a fog, his mind replaying the last moments he shared with Paul, searching for signs he might have missed. The funeral was held at St. Andrew's Church, the same place where Paul had been baptized and where he had sung in the choir with a voice too sweet for this world. The church was packed, the air thick with incense and the soft sobbing of those who knew and loved Paul. Mr. Peter stood by the coffin, his eyes fixed on the wood that now held his son, feeling a mix of anger, sorrow, and an unsettling curiosity. As the service proceeded, he noticed the undertaker, a man named Mr. Johnson, who seemed too eager to close the casket. Was it just the urgency to move on from such a tragic event, or was there something more? Mr. Peter's mind was a whirl of suspicion. The dirt under Paul's nails, the mismatched bruises, they all screamed for an explanation he hadn't yet received. After the burial, as everyone dispersed under the heavy sky that threatened rain, Mr. Peter lingered. He approached Mr. Johnson, his voice low but firm. "You seemed in a hurry to close my son's casket." Mr. Johnson, a man with years of experience in dealing with grief, replied, "I'm sorry, sir. It's just protocol to keep things moving smoothly. It's hard, I know." But his eyes didn't meet Mr. Peter's, a detail not lost on the grieving father. The next few days were spent in a haze of routine and mourning. Mr. Peter would sit in Paul's room, surrounded by his drawings, his books, his life, but his mind was never at rest. He revisited the accident scene, now marked only by the absence of Paul's laughter. The grass where he had lain was trampled, but there, at the edge, he noticed something. A small piece of fabric, not matching anything Paul wore. It was a clue, a whisper from the universe that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to this accident. He started piecing together the events of that day. He interviewed neighbours, piecing together Paul's last known movements. One neighbour, Mrs. Adebayo, remembered seeing a black car near the accident site, an anomaly in their quiet cul-de-sac. Another, young Michael, had seen a figure, someone not from their neighbourhood, lurking around just before the incident. None of this was in the police report. His nights were spent in research, looking into other cases, other accidents, seeking patterns or similar anomalies. The internet was both a friend and a labyrinth of information, but it led him to a chilling realization. There might be a pattern of unexplained deaths or disappearances in their area. Was Paul just another number in this unseen tally? The seed of doubt had grown into a tree of resolve. Mr. Peter knew he couldn't rely on the official channels. They had already closed the case on his son's death. He needed to take matters into his own hands. The idea seemed insane, but in his state of grief and suspicion, it was his only path forward. He would install a camera in Paul's coffin, a silent witness to whatever might unfold, or not, in the dark silence of the grave. As he prepared for this macabre plan, Mr. Peter felt the weight of his actions. Was he desecrating his son's rest, or was he honouring Paul's memory by seeking the truth? The moral ambiguity of his plan was not lost on him, but the need to know, to understand, overrode all else. With the camera set, the next chapter of his life was about to begin. One where he would either find peace or plunge deeper into a nightmare of revelations. The night was as quiet as the grave where Paul now lay, the moon casting long shadows over the tombstones. Mr. Peter sat in his living room, the glow of his laptop the only light in the house. His heart raced with a mix of fear and anticipation as he connected to the hidden camera he had placed in Paul's coffin. The feed was grainy, the darkness inside the coffin almost complete, but he watched, his eyes straining for any sign, any flicker that might reveal the truth. Minutes turned to hours, his eyes burning from staring at the screen. Then, there it was. A faint sound, like scraping or something being moved. His breath hitched. Was this just the settling of Earth, or something else? The image was too dark to see clearly, but there seemed to be a shadow moving against the stillness. He replayed the footage, his mind racing with possibilities. Could Paul have been alive when they buried him, or was there someone else in there with him? Sleep was elusive that night, his mind a whirl of theories and dread. The next morning, Mr. Peter decided to revisit the coroner's office. He needed to see the autopsy report again to confront the coroner with his findings. The report was as he remembered it, except for one glaring omission. The bruises he had seen on Paul's body were not mentioned. When he questioned the coroner, Dr. Okonkwo, about this, the man's response was evasive. "We document what we see, Mr. Peter. Perhaps you were seeing things through the lens of your grief." But Mr. Peter wasn't convinced. He had photos from the funeral home, taken in his raw state of shock, that clearly showed the bruises. He knew what he had seen. His next stop was the funeral home, where he confronted Mr. Johnson. "I saw movement in the coffin," he blurted out, watching Mr. Johnson's face for any sign of shock or guilt. Instead, he received a look of pity. "Mr. Peter, you're going through a lot. Maybe you should rest. Let this go." But Mr. Peter couldn't let it go. He had one more card to play, the piece of fabric he found. He took it to a local tailor, Mrs. Easy, known for her sharp eye and memory for fabrics. She examined it, her face turning to one of recognition. "This is from a suit, a very specific type. Not many people around here wear this, but I remember selling one to Mr. Ademola, the councilman's driver." The plot thickened. Mr. Ademola was known in the neighborhood, a quiet man but with connections to influential people. Could this be the link Mr. Peter was looking for? The twist in the tale came when he decided to follow Mr. Ademola, only to witness him meeting with none other than Dr. Okonkwo at a secluded cafe. Their conversation was too distant to hear, but their body language spoke volumes of secrecy and urgency. Returning home, Mr. Peter's mind was on fire with the implications. Was there a conspiracy involving local officials to cover up Paul's death? And if so, why? His investigation had now taken a dangerous turn, from personal grief to a potential exposure of corruption, or worse. That night he received an anonymous letter. No stamp, no address, just a note slipped under his door. It read, "Stop digging or you'll find more than you bargained for." The threat was clear, but instead of fear, it ignited a new resolve in Mr. Peter. They knew he was onto something, which meant he was on the right path. Suspense built as he realized he was no longer just a father seeking answers for his son's death. He had become a threat to those hiding in the shadows. With each step forward, the stakes rose. He knew he needed help, someone he could trust to navigate this murky water. The next day, he would reach out to an old friend from university, now a private investigator, to help him unravel this web of lies and secrets. The journey from here would test his courage, his resolve, and perhaps his sanity. But for Paul, he would not stop until the truth was laid bare. The morning light was harsh, reflecting off the dew-covered grass outside Mr. Peter's window, a stark contrast to the darkness that had enveloped his life. He had barely slept, the anonymous threat playing over in his mind like a broken record. But with the dawn came a new determination. He would not be intimidated. He contacted his friend Ade, now a private investigator with a reputation for digging up truths others wanted buried. Ade agreed to meet him at a small, out-of-the-ways cafe where they could talk without prying eyes or ears. As they sat with their coffee, Mr. Peter laid out everything. The camera footage, the fabric clue, the meeting between Ademola and Dr. Okonkwo, and the ominous note. Ade listened, his face growing sterner with each detail. "This isn't just about Paul's death anymore. It sounds like you've stumbled upon something bigger," he said, his voice low. Together, they decided to delve deeper into the backgrounds of everyone involved. Ade had access to resources Mr. Peter didn't, and he started with Mr. Ademola. A few hours later, Ade called with findings. Ademola has been in the employ of Councilman Chukwu for years, but there's whispers of him being involved in more clan. The plot thickened like the fog that rolled in from the coast. Mr. Peter felt a mix of vindication and dread. If Paul's death was connected to this, it meant his son might have been an innocent casualty in a much larger game. Their next move was to check the camera footage once more, this time with Ade's tech-savvy friend to enhance the quality. They met in Ade's office, the ambience filled with the hum of computers and the smell of old paper files. As the footage was cleaned up, they saw it, not just the shadow but what appeared to be a hand moving in the dark. The revelation was chilling. Was Paul buried alive, or was someone else in that coffin with him? The suspicion of foul play was now a certainty, but the why was still elusive. They needed more than suspicions. They needed proof. Ade suggested looking into other accidents in the community to see if there was a pattern. And there was. Several cases over the years, all seemingly accidental, but with connections to either Councilman Chukru or his associates. The twist came when they discovered one of these cases involved a whistleblower against local corruption, mysteriously killed in a car accident that was never thoroughly investigated. Was Paul's death a warning to others? A message to stay silent or face the consequences? Mr. Peter's world was turning upside down. The man who once only knew the joy of raising his son was now neck-deep in a conspiracy that touched the very pillars of his community. The grief was still there, but now it was coupled with a burning anger, a need to expose those who would use power to cover up their sins. That night, as he returned home, Mr. Peter felt the weight of every step. He knew he was being watched, the sense of being followed never far from his mind. But the anonymous threat had backfired. It had not scared him off, but rather cemented his resolve. He would not let Paul's death be just another statistic in someone's ledger of cover-ups. He decided to reach out to a local journalist, known for her fearless reporting on corruption, to share what he had found. But even as he planned his next move, doubt crept in. Was he putting others in danger? Was this pursuit of justice worth the potential cost? The moral dilemma was profound, but the need for truth, for justice, for his son was stronger. As he sat down to email the journalist, his computer screen flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw Paul's face in the reflection. It was a sign, or perhaps just the desperate yearning of a father's heart, but it bolstered him. Paul's legacy would not be silence, it would be the light that exposed the darkness. The story was far from over. It was just beginning to unravel, in ways Mr. Peter could never have imagined. Chapter 6. The camera decision. The night was unusually still, the kind of quiet that makes every sound seem amplified. Mr. Peter sat in his dimly lit study, the only light coming from the eerie glow of his laptop screen. The decision to share what he had discovered with a journalist weighed heavily on him, but first he needed to revisit the footage from Paul's coffin. The enhanced video had shown a hand, but there was more to see, more to understand. As he played the video back, the room seemed to grow colder. The darkness within the coffin was almost palpable through the screen, and the faint sounds of movement sent chills down his spine. He adjusted the audio, hoping to hear something, anything, that could explain what he had seen. The scraping sounds grew clearer, and then a whisper, so faint it might have been his imagination. But Mr. Peter knew better. It was a voice that didn't belong to his son, but was undeniably human. The horror of this realization gripped him. Someone had been in the coffin with Paul, or after him. The thought was macabre, like something out of a nightmare. He replayed the part where the shadow moved, now seeing it not just as a shadow, but as a figure bending over, perhaps messing with the camera itself. The implication was terrifying. Had they been watched, even in death? His heart raced as he thought about the implications. If someone had tampered with the coffin, what did that mean for Paul? Was he even dead when they buried him? The thought was unbearable, a horror story he was living. He needed to tell someone, to not bear this alone. He called Ade, his voice a whisper of urgency. "You need to see this. Ade, it's not just about Paul anymore. It's about something much darker." Eda arrived, his face grim under the dim light. Together they watched the footage again, this time with a sense of dread that filled the room. Eddie, usually unflappable, looked shaken. "We need to involve someone else, someone with authority or at least connections," he suggested. But who could they trust? The suspense built as they discussed their next steps, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Suddenly, the laptop screen flickered violently, the lights in the room dimmed, then surged back to life. It was as if the house itself was reacting to their discovery. Just then, a power outage plunged them into darkness, the only sound their shallow, panicked breathing. In the pitch black, Mr. Peter felt a presence, an unnatural chill that whispered of death and secrets. He fumbled for his phone, its light piercing the darkness, revealing nothing out of the ordinary, yet the feeling persisted. "We're not alone," he whispered, and Ade nodded, his hand reaching for his gun, a precaution he seldom needed to take. When the power returned, the screen of Mr. Peter's laptop was blank, the footage gone. Panic surged through him. Had he imagined it all? No, the backup was on an external drive, untouched. They checked and there it was, the video still intact. But the incident felt like a warning. Someone, or something, was trying to keep this hidden. The horror wasn't just in the physical evidence, but in the realization that they were up against forces that could manipulate reality around them. Mr. Peter's resolve hardened. He would not let this be just another mystery swept under the rug. He decided to meet the journalist at a neutral location, far from prying eyes or supernatural interferences. As they prepared to leave, Mr. Peter couldn't shake off the feeling that they were stepping into a narrative written by the hand of fear itself. The night had transformed from a mere backdrop to an active player in their quest, each shadow a possible enemy, each sound a potential clue or threat. The suspense of what lay ahead glued him to the moment, his heart a drumbeat of both fear and anticipation, for what truths the darkness would reveal next. The funeral had been a blur, a time when Mr. Peter was caught between the pain of loss and the sharp edge of suspicion. Now, revisiting those moments in his mind, he saw them with new eyes that looked for signs, for anything that would validate his growing fears. The church, once a place of comfort, now seemed like a stage set for a sinister He remembered the way the casket was handled, the haste with which Mr. Johnson, the undertaker, seemed to want to close it. Had he known something? Mr. Peter decided to return to the funeral home, not as a grieving father, but as an investigator. He needed to confront Mr. Johnson again, this time with the footage in mind. The funeral home was an old building, its Victorian architecture casting long, ominous shadows even in daylight. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lilies and formaldehyde. Mr. Johnson was at his desk, a man with an air of practiced condolence. "Mr. Peter, what brings you back here?" he asked, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "I need to talk about Paul's funeral," Mr. Peter said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. He pulled out his phone, showing the enhanced footage. "Explain this movement, this shadow." Mr. Johnson's face paled, his professionalism slipping. I don't know what you're talking about. It's not possible." But Mr. Peter wasn't there for denial. "You were in a hurry to close that casket? Why?" The undertaker's response was a stutter of excuses, but it was clear he knew more than he was letting on. Mr. Peter sensed fear, not just of him, but of something else. Something larger. The suspense built as Mr. Johnson finally spoke in a low, conspiratorial whisper. "There are things beyond my control. Things I was told to do. I didn't know." He looked around as if the walls themselves might listen. "After the service, I was instructed to check the casket. I thought it was just to make sure everything was secure." Mr. Peter's heart sank. "So you did tamper with the coffin?" The undertaker nodded, his face a mask of regret. "But it was empty when I checked. No one was supposed to be in there, I swear." This revelation added layers to the horror. If the coffin was empty when checked, who or what was caught on camera? The implications were chilling. Had someone been in there with Paul, or was there a darker force at play? Mr. Peter left the funeral home with more questions than answers, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. As he walked back to his car, the day seemed to darken, the clouds gathering as if in sympathy with his turmoil. He felt eyes on him, not just from the living, but from something else, something that didn't belong in the light of day. The feeling was palpable, a cold breath on the back of his neck, a whisper of warning, or perhaps a taunt from whatever or whoever was behind this. He decided to visit Paul's grave, a place he had avoided since the burial, now not just for mourning but for searching. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant cawing of crows. Standing before Paul's headstone, Mr. Peter felt a mix of grief and determination. He noticed something odd. The ground around the grave seemed disturbed, not just from the burial, but as if someone had been there recently. Kneeling down, he began to dig with his bare hands, the earth cold and unyielding. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he needed to see, to know. His fingers touched something hard, not a root or stone, but fabric, similar to what he had found before. His heart raced. This wasn't just about Paul anymore. It was about uncovering a truth that seemed to be buried with his son. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the graves, Mr. Peter knew he was on the cusp of something terrifying, something that might redefine his understanding of death, of life, and of the dark secrets hidden in plain sight. The suspense of what he might uncover next kept him rooted to the spot, the horror of the unknown a palpable force in the gathering dark. Chapter 8. Night of Revelation. The night had descended with an oppressive weight, the moon barely piercing the thick cloud cover, casting the cemetery in an eerie half-light. Mr. Peter, his hands still dirty from digging, pulled out the fabric he had found. It matched the piece from before, but this time there was more. A small, tarnished badge, one that looked like it belonged to an official of some sort. His heart pounded. This was a clue, a piece of the puzzle that was growing more macabre with each discovery. He decided to stay, to watch over Paul's grave, to see if whatever, or whoever, had disturbed it would return. He sat on a nearby bench, his eyes straining against the darkness, every shadow a potential threat. The silence was broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the whisper of wind through the trees, sounds that now seemed like omens rather than nature. As the night deepened, a figure appeared, moving with stealth towards Paul's grave. Mr. Peter's breath caught in his throat. He could barely see the features, but there was something unnaturally fluid about the figure's movements, like it wasn't fully of this world. He watched, hidden by the darkness, as the figure knelt by the grave, hands moving over the earth. The suspense was unbearable. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but fear held him back. Then the figure began to dig, not with tools but with bare hands. The sound of dirt being moved a chilling backdrop to the night. Mr. Peter's heart raced. What was this entity looking for, or was it trying to hide something? Suddenly, the figure stopped, looking up as if sensing Mr. Peter's presence. Their eyes met across the dim space, and Mr. Peter felt a cold dread wash over him. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, not with light but with something else, something ancient and malevolent. It stood, and in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, it spoke. "You should not have come here." The horror of the situation was palpable. Mr. Peter felt the air turn colder. The shadows around him seemed to writhe and grow. He fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight to confront this thing. But as the light hit the figure, it recoiled, hissing like something out of a nightmare. The light revealed not a human, but a form that was twisted. Its features blurred as if reality itself was bending around it. The creature lunged towards Mr. Peter, but he was faster, running towards the cemetery's exit, his heart pounding in his ears. As he ran, he heard the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, but a slithering, unnatural movement. He didn't dare look back, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just witnessed. Reaching his car, he locked himself inside, his hands shaking as he started the engine. The creature didn't follow, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Driving away, his headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, watching him leave. Its form now human, but those eyes were not. Back at home, Mr. Peter tried to make sense of what he'd seen. Was it a guardian of secrets, or something summoned by the darkness of the deeds done in his town? He looked at the badge, now a link to the supernatural horror he had just fled from. He needed answers, and fast. He decided to research the badge, finding it belonged to a long-disbanded secret society within the local government, known for occult practices and dark rituals. The horror deepened. Was Paul's death not just a cover-up, but part of a ritual? His phone buzzed, an unknown number. Answering, a voice, distorted and eerie, whispered, "You've seen too much, but there's more. Meet me at the old mill at midnight tomorrow. Come alone if you want to understand." The line went dead, leaving Mr. Peter with a choice that could either end his quest for truth or plunge him deeper into the abyss of horror he had just begun to uncover. The suspense was all-consuming now. Who was this mysterious caller? What awaited him at the old mill? And most terrifyingly, what had Paul's death truly unleashed? The night was far from over, and the revelations were just beginning. The night was thick with anticipation as Mr. Peter approached the old mill, a relic from a time when the town was just a whisper of its current self. The structure loomed over him, its windows dark eyes peering into the night, the river beside it whispering secrets of the past. He was alone, as instructed, but the weight of his gun in his pocket was a small comfort against the unknown. As he entered, the mill was silent, the only light from the moon filtering through broken slats. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, but not the creature from the cemetery. It was Ade, his face grim. "I got your back, brother. I couldn't let you do this alone," he said, his presence a relief in the sea of tension. A voice, neither fully human nor entirely otherworldly, echoed through the mill. "You seek answers, Peter?" It was the same voice from the phone. A figure stepped into the light, but it was not what he expected. It was Mr. Ademola, the councilman's driver, but his eyes held the same unnatural glow Mr. Peter had seen before. Ademola explained, his voice a mix of his own and something ancient. Paul's death was more than an accident. It was a sacrifice. The society you've been tracing, we've been using this town as a chessboard for dark energies, feeding on the grief and secrets we bury here. The horror of it all was overwhelming, but Mr. Peter's resolve was stronger. "Why, Paul?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear. "Because he was pure, untouched by the corruption of this place. His death was supposed to anchor a dark force here, but you've disrupted that with your quest for truth," Ademola confessed. The suspense built as Mr. Peter realized the true horror. Not just the conspiracy, but the supernatural force they had unwittingly unleashed. But then came the twist. Ade, having done his research, pulled out an old silver amulet, known in folklore to banish dark entities. "I thought this might be needed," he said, handing it to Mr. Peter. With a mix of horror and hope, Mr. Peter confronted Ademola, who was now clearly struggling with the entity within him. As he placed the amulet on Ademola, there was a sound like thunder, light erupting from nowhere, and the darkness within Ademola shrieked, then vanished. Ademola collapsed, the glow in his eyes gone, now just a man, freed from his torment. The mill shook, the very ground seeming to expel the darkness that had been festering there. The river beside seemed to cleanse itself, its waters turning clearer in the moonlight. The horror was ending, not with more darkness, but with the light of truth. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of hope, Mr. Peter and Ade walked out of the mill. They knew the fight against corruption was far from over, but this chapter was closed. Paul's death had not been in vain. It had led to the exposure of a dark secret, potentially saving countless others from a similar fate. They returned to Paul's grave, now with a sense of closure. Mr. Peter placed the amulet on Paul's headstone, a symbol of protection and peace. "You've helped us, son. Your light chased away the shadows," he whispered, feeling not just the presence of Paul, but a sense of his son's approval, a gentle breeze that felt like an embrace. In the end, the investigation had brought not only justice, but a cleansing of sorts. The town would never be the same, but it was now a place where light could begin to heal what darkness had touched. Mr. Peter felt a mix of sorrow and joy. Paul's legacy was one of change, of breaking cycles of fear and secrecy. It was a horror-happy ending, where the battle against darkness had not only been fought, but had also illuminated the path to a brighter future. Grief can fuel the quest for truth, turning darkness into light, revealing hidden evils and healing communities. If you were moved by this story, please share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you are watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Bemsy Stories for more epic tales like this. Thank you for watching.